Welcome to our afternoon panel titled Breaking the Conventional Wisdom on CVE, Examining the Evidence, Merits or Drawbacks of Commonly Held Intervention Strategies. I am Andy Blum. I lead the U.S. Institute of Peace is learning and evaluation efforts, so all of our sort of cross-cutting efforts to do what this panel is trying to do in regard to CVE, learn from what we're doing, reflect from what we're doing, bring evidence to help us make better decisions. So I'm very excited to be here, and thanks to the Alliance for Peace Building for giving me the opportunity to help moderate this panel. I'm joined on this panel by Irfan Saeed, the Director for Countering Violent Extremism at the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the State Department, by Dr. Jen Heeg, who's a project director with SSG Advisors and soon to be an independent consultant. From Candice Rondeau, who's a senior, she asked me to say that. Candice Rondeau, who's a senior program officer and a colleague of mine at USIP, and Dr. Rebecca Wolf, director of Mercy Corps Peace and Conflict Team. So a great sort of broad range of perspectives. The program promises a lively, fast-paced discussion on this issue. So we're going to try to make it a little organic. We're not going to give presentations. I'm going to ask some questions and ask our panel to weigh in on these questions for about 45 minutes, and then we want a lot of input from you, and we're going to try to keep it lively and fast-paced. So mediator's plea, quick, sharp comments or questions, and we'll get a discussion going. I'm going to give just a tiny wind-up to our discussion here. As I was coming in today, I realized that I was actually in this room on 9/11 in 2001. We saw the second building go down on this screen that's behind us. I was remembering all the USG people ran out to the payphones that are no longer out there in the hallway. But it struck me that here we are 15 years later, still talking about violent extremism, still trying to really get our hands around this problem and make progress. So, a good time to be breaking the conventional wisdom, or at least interrogating the conventional wisdom. And that's what we're going to try to do here today. And then I think the only other thing I would say is, as Ambassador Robinson teed up earlier today, we're still at the beginning stages maybe of learning about this, but interventions are underway, policies are being set, programs are being implemented. So we need to figure out how to use the evidence we have to make better decisions. We can't wait for perfect knowledge here. We have to point our way with the evidence we have. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about the conventional wisdom. I'd ask the panelists and you to remember that we're all part of the conventional wisdom. We all have our own sort of biases and our own conventional wisdom. So let's interrogate our own thinking as well. So with that, I want to throw out to the panel, and maybe I'll start with Rebecca, because she did the hard work of putting this panel together in many ways. So she gets pride of place to start. Our first question, to the group is, what approaches to CVE do you think have a strong evidence base? Where do we know things work and there's good evidence to say this is what we should be doing?
So where I'm seeing at least hope, where I think we're starting to find approaches that work, are at local levels. And so I'll give two examples from a recent report we just did on Nigeria and Boko Haram. And in addition to looking in this study about why young people join these movements, we really decided in this study to look at what helped them resist. And there were two surprising findings in there. One is that there's been a lot of talk about counter messaging, but not a lot of evidence for it working. And actually in Northeast Nigeria, we did find evidence of it working. But it wasn't these big social media campaigns that we're hearing about. It was really working with local leaders and religious leaders who were talking about how Boko Haram was just as corrupt, or if not more corrupt, than the government. And that really, when young people said why they resisted, those messages were what was coming to our researchers. And so that, to me, felt like, okay, counter-messaging can work, but there are very limited conditions. One other reason we have speculated it may work in Northeast Nigeria is that there isn't a strong external military presence there. And so Boko Haram itself has had less ability to come up with a strong narrative. So the need to come up with a strong counter narrative isn't there compared to what we've seen in the Middle East. The other piece there where we've seen in Nigeria and actually in Jordan, and we have a program now doing this in Jordan, is the importance of family members talking to their children about these groups. And again, when young people have said they resisted or left, in Jordan we had foreign fighters who came back, they would say it was their mothers who brought them back. Or in Nigeria, it was that their parents talked to them about Boko Haram. And so we are working much more with parents to have these conversations with their children. So, yeah.
Irfan, I wonder if you could just speak to that as well more. I mean, we heard some this morning about the USG perspective on this, the new things that are happening within your bureau. So, where's your thinking on these issues?
Well, I would actually second what was just said, because when you talk about the big tagline for countering violent extremism, the tagline is go local. So you have to develop that local capacity before you can finally see some results. I think what I can do at the State Department is sort of frame where the counter messaging, where the role of families helps to fit in all this. And I'm sure Ambassador Robinson this morning talked a lot about some of the changes that the State Department's going through. Part of it is, again, to frame how we look at CVE. And those of you who heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about these 4 areas. These 4 areas include research, prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation, reintegration. So when you look at, I think, the counter-messaging piece and you look at the role of families, it's very clear that that has not only a preventive aspect to it, but it has an interventive aspect to it. That is, you can stop individuals from thinking about joining these terrorist groups through, the very preventive type of strategic messaging that's out there, again, at a very local level. Or you can pull people away from the lure of ISIL or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or the various terrorist groups that are out there by showing them the damage that they can do, bringing people from apathy to empathy.
I'm going to put my colleague on the spot here a little bit, so apologies in advance, Candace. But on this issue of the local, we're talking about evidence here, and so I know with the Resolve Network and the work, we want that local knowledge, but then we want to find kind of how to generalize as well. So even kind of on the issue of local knowledge and how we pull those lessons out, I wonder if you could share a bit of what Resolve is doing or how you're thinking about that challenge.
So, as you all know, I think Ambassador Robinson referenced Resolve earlier this morning. The impetus for this network of researchers and practitioners and policymakers really comes out of an acknowledgement that we don't really know quite enough about the local drivers. We don't have much that we can say about the context-specific nature of the outbreak of, or I should say, the emergence and or expansion of violent extremist groups or violent social movements in places like Bamako. We probably know more today about Kabul than we do about Bamako, just because we've been spending so much time there. But I think what we've learned in building the Resolve network in the last little while, and really it truly just got off the ground early this year in partnership with CSO, is that there's not just an evidence gap, right? There is a very serious challenge in terms of tapping into a research community, a local research community, that truly understands the difference between tribal relationships, that truly understands the political economy of recruitment patterns. These things are missing from the conversation, largely because so much of our analysis has been driven by people like me and people who are sitting here on this panel, actually, frankly. And that's a fine thing, but at this stage, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a serious gap in capacity but also just connectivity between local researchers and the wider policy-making community, both at the local, national level, but also internationally. So I think Resolve is kind of trying to frame its efforts to build that capacity and that connectivity by bringing online early career and mid-career researchers who can really drive the train forward. We can talk a little bit more about that, but I think the critical part here is it is no longer Washington's place or Brussels' place to drive forward the agenda on understanding what's happening with violent social movements. It really has to come from the ground up.
Jen, did you want to follow up on that?
I would love to follow up on that because that speaks to kind of my core beliefs in this field. I've been in this field for a few years now, and I've been working in the Middle East and North Africa for about 10 years. And what I've learned more than anything is that the risk for violent extremism at the local level is very low. And it's a problem that we talk about. It gets a lot of attention. We get the Academy Ballroom at the Alliance for Peace Building. But really, when we talk at the community level, we've spoken firsthand with people from Iraq and Morocco and everything in between. And what they say is that youth are at risk for a lot of things. They're at risk for unemployment, they're at risk for crime, they're at risk for drugs, they're at risk for gangs, they're at risk for wanting to illegally immigrate to Europe and now to Syria, but that's part of a very complex, wicked problem. And so to think about, the evidence base, I guess what I would advocate for is thinking against linear sort of processes and more to think about these systems. And VE is part of a system. And in many cases, even in the Middle East, even in Iraq, maybe not the most important part of the system. So I guess I would like to kind of temper the entire conversation around VE in DC if possible to say, it's really, there was somebody at the USIP conference on evidence that we did a couple months ago that said CVE and violent extremism really punches above its weight in terms of the attention it's paid in DC vis-a-vis other forms of conflict. And I just want to remind, I think, all of us of that. I think it's easy to get caught up in this very Washington-based priority. And if we're looking at the communities as a local system, then we're going to be just taking an entirely different perspective.
I think that feeds in well to the next question I want to ask. I mean, when I came on board and started working on learning and evaluation at USIP, one of the things I would ask my colleagues is, what should we stop doing? What do we know doesn't work? And it was a question that was interesting because it was very hard to answer. We talk a lot about best practices, but what about worst practices? And so I'd like to throw out to the group, and Jen, I mean, I can start with you here as well. What should we stop doing? And I'd like to ask the panel, maybe not the securitized approach, maybe not the hard approach, but even in the kind of more preventive space, even in the more CVE space, what are the kind of interventions that the evidence are telling us we should just stop doing?
That's a great question, and it's very directed because I was thinking about evidence very broadly. But just in terms of programming, I think we have a weak evidence base around singular targeted programming that try to identify a set of at-risk youth and then intervene there directly to give them jobs or to message for them or whatever the case may be. To me, the mode of intervention is kind of irrelevant. The point is how the targeting happens, and it's in the program design. So again, I would move us towards taking a more systemic approach and thinking about CVE as multi-layered.
If I could follow up, where is that system? Is that system the community? Is that system, what's the sort of boundaries of the system that you kind of have in mind when you say that?
That's a great question. So just to take Morocco as one example, we just came back as a team from Morocco and looked at some really great programming that's happening. And they were looking at the neighborhood level. And the neighborhood includes schools and community centers, anything that youth are doing kind of in their free time. It includes parents and then the education and training for those parents, employment centers. And it was really, in that case, it was geographically sort of bounded, but it was around all of the actors coming and going out of that place. And I think the important thing, the programs we saw that were really successful were doing was creating resilience and creating a sense of place, a sense of belonging in that place. And that to me is a really important approach.
Other thoughts on what we should stop doing?
I mean, I would underscore what Jen's saying. So I'm seeing a lot of push in this field right now to come up with assessment tools to be able to identify those young people who are most at risk of radicalization or joining one of these groups. And I see this both in MENA and in the violent extremism affected countries, but also seeing it in LAC as well. Latin America, and working with gangs. And the evidence for being able to develop these tools and figure out what I call the needle in the haystack problem is really low. And where, again, a community neighborhood approach where it's a multi-layered intervention with schools, families, local government. We've seen, at least in the US, around gang work, that has been the most productive. So the Harlem Children's Zone, which was Obama's model for his, I forget the name of the plan, but he had 10 neighborhoods around the country where he expanded this, and that seemed to work. But when we've tried to do that actually with other internationally, we've had a harder time to have that concentrated approach because of the need to hit numbers. And so that's been a real challenge in being able to take that really a neighborhood approach to this problem.
Just teeing this up for the discussion, if there are folks in the audience who work on anti-gang activities or that kind of outreach program, love to hear from you, because I think one of the things I've seen is how much opportunity I think there is for cross-fertilization and frankly some hard-won lessons in that space that might be very relevant here. Yeah, Irfan.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things. I think one of the things we look at in terms of our programming across the State Department is this sort of idea that one size fits all. And many years in the past, I think we've taken this scattershot approach. Well, we know this works. If we can just alleviate poverty, we can solve violent extremism. So all of a sudden, you took this scattershot approach where you're throwing anti-poverty programs at the issue. And what we've learned, what we've seen very clearly in some of the great research that you guys have done, that that's not the case. Poverty does not necessarily drive violent extremism. So we have to stop programming for the sake of programming and go much more local. Even a national approach cannot work sometimes. A perfect example is Pakistan. If you want to program in Pakistan, what you're doing in Lahore is very different than what you're doing in Peshawar and what you're doing in Karachi, Sindh, and certain areas. So you have to look at the problem at a very, very localized level to pick up on the first point. Second thing I would say is, we're as a response, something you can measure is a law enforcement response. I used to be a prosecutor back in the day, and every week my bosses would have the printout of cases. We actually used to have those laser printouts, and we'd have the printouts, and they would ask, all right, what are you doing on this case every day? Are you indicting? Are you putting someone in jail? And if I said, well, no, I'm working to prevent, I wouldn't necessarily get the highest marks, right? So what we're trying to do now is figure out a way, in addition to the very law enforcement response that needs to take place, the investigation, the arrest, the prosecution, also look at the off-ramps, also look at the alternatives to prosecution, the hotlines, the centers, the mental health aspects to get these kids off of this pathway of radicalization. And the final thing I will say is, like all of us here, we've been in this space a very long time. And the first thing you hear, even today, is it's the ideology. And if you want to do something to counter violent extremism, we have to find those moderate voices, those tolerant voices. And the research has shown over and over, especially with the new recruits that Daesh is pulling in every day, it really has nothing to do with the ideology. In fact, it's a hard misconception and a misinterpretation of the ideology. So if we can get away from this, if we can just get better Muslims and more tolerant Muslims, then we're going to solve this problem. That is not the case.
Even Ambassador Robertson talked about the conventional wisdom, talked about this issue this morning. And in terms of, really interrogating or breaking the conventional wisdom, I think, that issue right there is one who was talking about the one idea. Maybe that's the one idea we can walk away with today. Because that's something I think is an important thing we're learning sort of right now.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, well, listen, I mean, I'm a journalist by training and public policy analyst sort of secondarily, and so my list of what's wrong is pretty long. It's sort of in my DNA to kind of list what's wrong. And so, I mean, the things that kind of come to mind very quickly, certainly around the counter-narrative and the counter-messaging sort of paradigm that is imposed on CVE work is, I just sort of wondered, which narrative are you actually countering? In these environments. You're talking about, prospectively a population of roughly 1 billion people that spans somewhere from, Eastern Europe all the way out to Southeast Asia. I'm just trying to understand, which narrative we're trying to address, and whether that can be effective. If that one singular, apparently monolithic narrative, can be addressed effectively with online interventions, for instance. I think one thing that, I'm certain that you have found, and I think I've heard from others, in terms of interventions on the counter-narrative side, is there's sort of alternative messaging that you want to sort of think about and engage with, but there's also this idea that actually a lot of these conversations don't take place online. They have to take place in person. You need interlocutors who are influential and trustworthy, who are drawn from the communities, and who can speak the language of the communities that they come from. And it's true in gang prevention as well, that some of the interlocutors that are the most effective are those who have actually spent time in prison and come out and sort of change their view on the world. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and Pakistan interviewing former Taliban fighters. And I found frequently, particularly in the east along the Pakistani border, that former fighters would come out and they would say, "Look, I felt I was an instrument of Pakistan." This is not unusual to understand whether you're a low-level fighter or a high-level fighter, however you are, capital T, Taliban or small. It's not unusual to be sort of have an understanding after a number of years of exposure to the battlefield that you are an instrument of state policies. And I think the one thing I would like to say that I think that is not effective is to ignore externalities and to ignore historical contingencies in the way that we address the challenges in these communities that are affected by conflict. There's nothing more offensive, frankly, than to go into Algeria or Morocco or frankly Tunisia and say, we know what you're about, but we've forgotten completely that there was a revolution here 60 odd years ago. There's nothing more offensive than that. And I think programming and policy making really needs to acknowledge these externalities. There are other externalities, of course. I think that not only the State Department and DoD and others are required to kind of really acknowledge in their programming, to wit, sometimes our complicity or our perceived complicity in the making of conflict in certain places, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what does not work, of course, is to ignore those challenges and to not sort of integrate that into your programming.
Just something to add to that in terms of breaking conventional wisdom. And in our Afghanistan work, which got most of the attention for showing that a vocational program did not have any impact on participation in violence, even though it had great employment outcomes. But there was another finding in that study that showed that young people who had more of a nationalist identity were actually more likely to endorse political violence than those who felt less of a national identity. And we often think that in these programs that if we had people more attached to the state, that they wouldn't endorse violence. But how we've interpreted that data is thinking about Afghanistan and the fact that they've had these external players coming in all these years, and having that national identity had these young people more protective of the country and so forth, were willing to defend it. And so it's really important to have that perspective when analyzing data, particularly these large data sets.
Any other thoughts before we move on approaches that have a strong evidence base, or approaches that we should stop doing because there's a weak evidence base? Just want to make sure I'm giving anyone
one last
final
thought.
Okay.
Cash for
your
work.
long list.
Sorry, I am long on this, but this is long. But no, really, cash for work is one of those things that I really think, wow, what a pernicious set of interventions it has spawned over the last 15 years. I mean, it's not to say that there is no relationship between employment and human agency. There is a relationship between these two things. I think there's a strong evidence base for wanting to be a productive member of society, or at least perceived to be. But cash for work does not necessarily change the patrimonial structure, power relations between, frankly, a population that is stratified not just by class but by age. I think people often forget, we talk about traditional societies. Some of that tradition is, the role of youth. I don't know how many people in here remember, children should be seen and not heard, right? So in some cultures it can be quite extreme, and to question authority and or sort of raise your own kind of views and not find them validated is, I think, extremely disheartening, right? But it does not compute that you then give a person cash for work and then therefore that's all cured. It doesn't solve the problem of how much it costs to get married, in Pakistan, because it costs an awful lot. It does not solve the problem of what it takes to start your own business in Cairo. All it does is, I think, spread more cash and money around and change the political economy of an already very polluted system. So I would just sort of say, please stop with cash for work programming.
And that's actually a great point. One of the dangers of this is having CVE just seem as the latest cash cow. And everybody wants to join in and say, this program that I've been doing for many years, it's a good program, but all of a sudden I'm getting no funding because, to your point, the world now is focused on CVE. So now I'm going to say my local program to get more cows into this village is a CVE program. There's a big danger to that, in the metrics, the evaluation, but just in the way that you're actually doing development or very good preventive work in the first place, it should not always carry that moniker of CVE.
Sure, yeah, just to build off of that, and maybe something we can talk about in the broader discussion, is kind of interrogating what we mean by evidence and what we mean by evidence-based in general in the field of countering violent extremism. So, we're all friends here. Our team has had a lot of talk about how to conduct the highest, most rigorous sort of evaluation possible of our project, right? And so we've gone back and forth on how to do that. We've talked about how to do a large N quantitative impact evaluation with a comparison group, and we've talked about how to do a much more systems and complexity aware evaluation. And I think for me, where I personally, and I will disagree with some members of my team here, where I personally am coming down is that an impact evaluation with a comparison group and that sort of model that's seen as rigorous and best here in DC can be really dangerous in a CVE context. When you have a comparison group, even if it's people who are waitlisted and maybe getting the program later, you run the risk of pissing people off. And the whole point of our projects is to engage, right? And to lessen frustration and make people feel part of something. So there are some real challenges on the ground that kind of limit that sort of programming. And at the same time, the systems change I'm talking about isn't easily measured or isn't best measured using those traditional techniques, in my opinion. So I think we really need to shift our focus and to think about evidence that works in our case, and that is evidence that is complexity aware and systems based.
One of the things, it's in the title of the panel today, is breaking the conventional wisdom, and one of the ways that happens is when you find evidence that just surprises you, wow, like that's not what I expected to see, something else is going on here. And I wonder if I could ask the panelists to think about, when was that last time you saw something that actually did surprise you? As you say, we've been doing this for a while. Sometimes we get jaded. Not always. Sometimes we get jaded. But what was that last time that you were surprised by evidence that really sort of changed your thinking about this problem set?
I can tell you briefly. The first time I was really shocked was when we actually did a comprehensive effort to look at some of the research to find those drivers, because even just a few years ago we saw this immense spike of not only people leaving to join terrorist groups in foreign conflict zones, but even here in the United States in the last few years we've seen this spike of individuals, again, either commit terrorist attacks here in the United States or get arrested for trying to commit a terrorist attack in the United States. So we undertook this sort of massive research. Let's figure out what the drivers are. And actually, George Washington University's program on extremism did a pretty good study on this. And what shocked me was that there's no profile. Whenever we think there's one profile, these are the type of people that are drawn to this type of behavior, boom, somebody else comes along. And I'll tell you, the specific case that really shocked me was Omar Abdul Muttalib from a couple years ago. Those of you who don't recall, he was the young Nigerian kid, actually from one of the wealthiest families in Nigeria. His father, I think, was the Ministry of Finance. And you know, we know people who know his family. And you know, they talk about a pretty good family, a well-to-do type of family. And what drew this kid, who had spent time in the U.S., had spent time in some of the best schools, to decide to put a bomb in his underwear and try to blow up a plane, that just boggles the mind. And so that, to me, was the first step in understanding that there is no one profile. Each one of these cases really is different in its own right.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah.
Okay, just because Irfan just inspired me by saying that. I think that's true that maybe there's not one profile, but we can think about, and we have thought about for years, you know, drivers of VE fitting into certain categories. You know, political, socioeconomic, and cultural are the ones in the driver's guide. And I think what's not surprising to me, but overdue for its attention are the psychological drivers, the individual level drivers. And I think this is where we get the wild card part, right? So again, this goes back to the fact that the risk of violent extremism is very low. And so we can't say entire marginalized communities are at risk because it may be one youth from that community or maybe one finance minister's son. And that's where I think we really should be focusing some attention. Is there are a set of risk factors that we understand are common, but none of them are predictive. And I don't think we're going to get predictive, but adding a psychological lens will be able to help us understand better what are, you know, maybe certain sets of profiles.
Can you just say a couple more sentences about what you mean by psychological lens?
Sure. So it's interesting. The first time that was ever mentioned in a forum I was at was in the Horn of Africa, and it was actually Yemeni people who were dealing with extremism in their community. And it was a very localized problem, and they were saying these kids have some sort of mental disturbance. This was them talking about their experience. And it seemed like all the DC people like really bristled and were very uncomfortable with these Yemenis who were saying we would really like to know what we can do for like helping them, for socializing them. They're isolating themselves, they're angry. And so I think there's a lack of programming around, you know, really the basic stuff like life skills training, but up to cognitive behavioral therapy and individualized psychosocial support. And there's a whole spectrum of support we can be giving from a broader community level to individualized teaching teachers to understand and recognize when a child is displaying behavioral issues. And again, to me, it's not about VE. It's about the fact that that kid may be at risk for any number of things. And VE is kind of almost a lucky accident in that we get funding to be able to work with these youth. And that's kind of the perspective I'm taking. But I think there's a lot to be explored. And another challenge is, I'll shut up, this is more than 2 sentences, but one more challenge we have are, you know, the lack of experts. Psychological assessment and treatment takes experts. I can't just walk in and do a workshop and then expect 20 people to go out and do that. And so there's a real kind of structural challenge we're running up against in the Middle East, for example, where we don't have therapists for every 100 kids.
Rebecca?
So to add on to Jen's point and then to the broader question, so again, I think the psychological factors are important. And so in one of the studies we did, not focused on VE, but political violence more generally, one of the strongest correlates to engagement in political violence was exposure to violence. And again, this is something that's pretty common in the Latin America gang work as well. And that's more domestic violence in that area versus we want to explore in other countries is in domestic violence and this other exposure to violence because of the military interventions. In terms of surprising evidence, and I'm going to use almost 2 contradictory stories. So in Jordan, one of the most surprising findings for me was the fact not that employment or poverty didn't predict whether or not young people would go into Syria to fight, it was that they were willing to pay to go. It was actually an economic sacrifice to their families often for them to go, because they had to pay to get smuggled in, and often they were employed and the family was no longer having that income. On the counter side to that is in our Northeast Nigeria work, where we saw loans were a very effective recruitment tool. And this is actually in some ways contradictory to all the other evidence that we've been showing how employment isn't important. And it's not about employment. So we had employed youth joining Boko Haram and not. It was really about inequality. And the fact that Northeast Nigeria is much more of a capitalist system than many of the other countries where we've been studying violent extremism. And so what we've been thinking about more is this political economy of recruitment. So recruiters are very smart and they know what's going to motivate a young person to come. So there's all these factors, there's probably a trigger event that creates that anger, but then the recruiters are there to know how to use that lever. And so that's why it's really important to understand that context.
Thinking about it, I'm thinking about reflecting on the difference between social marginalization and social stratification, and how critically that plays into so much violence, actually. Mm-hmm. This feeling, this looking at your neighbor, looking at the Joneses next door and realizing they've got a Hummer, why don't I? Mm-hmm. Because that's a real deal, and I think that we spend so much time sort of looking at, South Asia or, the Sahel or North Africa as these deeply impoverished places, and yes, there is poverty there. But what is the quality of that poverty? And also, what is the quality of the wealth that defines that stratification? Because when you have, your next door neighbor on the take, has a job at the Ministry of Finance or has a job at, the local family youth center, but also is pocketing, programming money, that creates a kind of social stratification and a perception of power that is absolutely devastating. And certainly enhances or potentially widens the violent minority. But thinking about surprising evidence, for me, as I said, I come from a background of looking really at violence at the level of definite impact. So I can't really count how many bombings I've actually, bomb sites I've actually been to since 9/11. Actually, my second day on the job for the Daily News was in New York on 9/11. And so, sort of my generation, I think, of sort of professional witnesses has been informed by this reality. And one thing that I think is really interesting, thinking about it, one very big surprising study has recently been done by Jason Lyle out of Yale on the impact of airstrikes and civilian casualties on local communities, which we've always sort of thought, well, this drives people to want to seek revenge. Well, it does two things. It usually destroys and decimates villages and empties them out and creates whole new displaced populations, which is a whole other risk category going to sort of the trauma and the violence exposure over time. I think there's certainly sort of a big base there for further inquiry. But the second thing is actually, rather than seeking revenge, right? Because of course most of these villages are emptied out after a major mass casualty event, whether it's an airstrike or a bombing of some sort. It actually incentivizes the local Taliban, Hizb Islami, or local thugs really, to get out there and say, no, we're still here, and then drive forward with yet another attack in the same location, enhancing the cycles of violence, exponentially actually. So, I think that's a very surprising piece of evidence that we really need to kind of look deeper into.
I'm going to give the panel sort of a chance to give a last word, say anything else that's on their mind. The question we have in front of us or that we talked about was, where do you feel CVE should be headed? We've already talked a bit about that in terms of the going local. So anything to that, or any just sort of last thoughts you have, we can just work down the panel, starting with you.
Yeah, I like what was said at the beginning. It's going local. And I actually wrote that down, go local. These products, these programs must be community owned. In an ideal world, I put myself out of a job. And you've probably heard Ambassador Robinson and others talk about this expansion of CVE at the State Department and expansion of CVE and the creation of a new secretariat at USAID. And of course, the domestics have created this new CVE task force. So we are getting bigger and bigger in our bureaucracy. And that means we're getting bigger and bigger in the type of funding we're going to put towards violent extremism and countering violent extremism projects worldwide. But in an ideal world, we get the government out of that space. We build empathy from communities who are dealing with this problem. We don't punch above our weight. So CVE is not just this end-all, do-all, magical pot of gold coins that everybody can point to. You can actually say that in this particular area, in this particular village, there's an issue. And the community in that particular village, in that particular town, is now well suited to address that issue, be it psychological factors, be it poverty, be it unemployment, underemployment, what have you. They will be able to know what those very localized drivers are for those localized individuals who are being drawn to this type of radical and violent ideology and violent movement, if you will. And getting the government out of that space, that to me in a nutshell would be success.
Yeah, I mean, I have to second that. I mean, go local, but also understand what local really truly means, I think is really critical. Because I think there's a great temptation here in Washington and other capitals to kind of want to see a level of authenticity reflected back at Washington or at Brussels that is actually kind of imagined. There's the diaspora for Pakistan or for Syria or for Iraq or for Mali is actually pretty wide and very diverse. And there's no reason why the diaspora returning back to their own home countries shouldn't be invited to engage. But also I would say there's no reason why local actors need to have any particular specific kind of set way of presenting themselves. I think that the other thing is to remember that we have to be able to talk across cultural lines. But in terms of where CVE should go, I would say it really needs to engage beyond definitional problems. I think one of the fundamental issues that we have now is research that is driven by this constant focus on what is radicalization, what is extremism, what is terrorism. Nobody's going to know. The answer is not really out there. It is extremely politicized. It's highly charged. But there's work to be done, particularly in the area of public health. There is work to be done, particularly in terms of understanding kind of the sociology, the social psychology of communities at risk for prolonged exposure to violence, and so that's where we need to be directing our gaze.
To add to that, I would say I appreciate the conversation and Ambassador Robinson's remarks about the importance of conflict prevention. And ICG's report, I think, has been really influential in showing that violent extremist groups emerge when there's already conflict going on. And so we really need to be better at that conflict prevention. With that, it's that looking at community resilience. And so what are the factors that keeps a community cohesive so that groups can't infiltrate? And we've see some preliminary evidence in Iraq around when people felt that the government was going to be much fairer or more inclusive, people were less likely to endorse political violence. But now it's really on trying to understand what those interventions are that really help that inclusion.
I would second everything that's said here, but go on a completely different tangent and say that where CVE should be headed is a systematic analysis of masculinity. I think, unlike, this is just coming, from an analyst perspective. If you look at water and sanitation issues, if you look at education issues, if you look at AIDS and malaria, if you look at all the development challenges in the world, they affect men and women, boys and girls in different ways. But most people are affected kind of equally. VE is primarily a male problem. And that's not to say that it's not a societal problem, because it is. But most people who join these groups are males. So why is that? And why haven't we paid explicit attention to that? I see a lot of reports, including my own team's excellent report on women's participation in violent extremism in MENA. It's a great report, but why weren't we asked for a report on male participation? Male participation. I think that's some place that is really ripe for exploration. And I would also say, if you're interested in that, because I heard applause, what has made me think about this in a really systematic way, kind of tying together my academic background where this is important with the programmatic, is in a Safer World report on masculinities in conflict that came out a couple years ago. And I think we should be building off of that and using the expertise here to really think through masculinity.
Thank you. And thank you for all of those great comments and thoughts. Now we would like to open it up for the audience. Are we going to pass the mics around or have people go to the mic? Okay, so let's get a couple of comments right here at these two middle tables right here. Go, right here. I wish I knew folks' names. We'll just sort of move across in the front here and then for a first round of comments. And again, fast, lively discussion, questions or comments, but keep them relatively brief, and please.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Subhi Shah, and I come from Pakistan, the northwest of Pakistan. I actually run an organization called Aware Girls, which is working to counter violent extremism in the northwest of Pakistan. We did a research actually, and in the tribal areas and the northwest of Pakistan, and the results were that 45% of the people supported the Taliban ideology, and 82% of the people responded that they will be, if they get an opportunity in their life, they will be ready to martyr for the sake of religion, Islam, and Pakistan. And every second person was of this opinion that it's okay to use religion for proliferating the religious and political ideology. So in that environment, we have established a youth peace network, which is working specifically to counter violent extremism among young people. And we are working to provide conducive environment where there is no space for violent ideologies and which is more conducive for peace building. So we are actually, we are directly working with more than 600 young people and reaching out to 3,000 young people annually. So the purpose of sharing is that, yes, I do agree with what all of you have said, that the solutions have to be local because there are a lot of international resolutions or international commitments, but until and unless the solutions come from the local, it cannot be achieved. Other point that I want to mention is that there has to be more investment in youth-led peace initiatives, and the world currently is investing more in militarized interventions, which is creating more and more, which is actually the militarization, the militarized intervention has been cashed by these militant groups to recruit more and more young people. So I would like to connect actually to all of you and to listen from you as well on these issues, and also have, I think it's great to listen from all of the panelists. It was great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can you just hand the mic here?
Thank you. I'm Katherine Hughes. I'm with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And what we look at is actually conflict that's positive and constructive and plays a connecting role and complementary role with peace building. So listening to you, I'm going to either go one step farther outside the box and the traditional thinking. I just got back from Kenya and Uganda and headed to West Africa, and we work a lot in various regions in the world locally with groups that are experiencing violent extremism. And what I'd like to say is, again, I'm hearing a lot. I heard power issues, power analysis, heard a lot about grievances. So what I'd like to say is I think a lot of times, and what again we're hearing locally, is some of these situations people have a right and are very rational to feel angry, to feel there's grievances, to feel there's issues. And so to kind of say, okay, maybe it's psychological, which I think there are aspects of that. Maybe they're just angry, we need to calm them down or redirect them. What if, and I'm hearing kind of the starting of that, what if we recognize that there's actually a need for conflict, that there's a need for conflict that's not violent, that would change power imbalances, would actually lead to dealing with grievances, dealing with rights and human rights and justice in a number of areas that you're talking about systemically. And what we're being asked, we do a lot of training and information sharing on how strategic nonviolent action works, how people power works, how to wage it well. And so what we're finding is people are saying, look, these people, a lot of these areas, they are not going to just be quiet and go home. They are not going to just listen to some messages and say, okay, we don't have some real issues. We need to deal with those issues. But if we can look at ways to learn how to struggle nonviolently and do it effectively, and that they can actually see our outcomes, which our research is showing it's double as effective to struggle nonviolently as with armed struggle, that if they can see it can be effective, they would be willing to try this and use this and redirect this to change things for justice and human rights, but without using violence. And so it's constructive conflict rather than destructive, violent conflict. And so I'd really like to look at that possibility as well. We see it as part of a conflict transformation. We're going to be looking at the umbrella tomorrow, or Thursday, in a plenary session that we've helped organize, with the idea that there's a whole menu of possibilities with peace building, transformative justice, transitional justice, and nonviolent conflict, and where to use which ones at which times, all of which to counter violent extremism. So that's what I'd like to add. Thanks.
Let's get a couple more comments. I'm already seeing some nice threads being pulled together.
Hi, my name is Siham Yousef. So I'm with an organization called Generations for Peace. We're based in Jordan, but we also have programs in Asia, Africa, and Europe. So the way the organization works is that we train local volunteers to address peace-building issues in their community. So in that sense, it is fundamentally locally led peace-building. But I want to bridge on the point about following the cash flow that has been raised on this panel earlier as well, which is that NGOs locally face the challenge of rebranding programs to look like CVE programs in order to get funding. And creating an environment locally where the advice is to go local, but NGOs are basically facing the challenge of adapting to that, to the reality of funding, or collapsing at what they do. And I was just wondering if you have any suggestions on how government agencies or funders can actually address this within the CVE field.
Let's stop there and to pull a bit of a thread together for the first two comments. I mean, I think there's a very interesting question, especially given what we heard earlier from you all about, what if at least aspects of extremism are sort of a dominant force in a society, or at least the ingredients for extremism as well. If folks are quite rational to have grievances that might lead to extremism. I mean, does that change how you think about what interventions you might put in place? And then also this very tricky issue around the punching above your weight. I mean, additional comments on that would be great.
Yeah, I think when you talk about grievances of course can be good. We have a colleague at the State Department who says, I'm not worried about the guy protesting in the street angry as hell. I'm worried about the guy in his basement online just sitting there festering. That's the issue. This needs to be directed. And when we talk about addressing grievances, we're not talking about having people be silenced in their grievance. We're talking about is having it addressed in a way that doesn't necessarily equal violence. If we can get people to turn away from that community of interest that they may have, that has a sort of a like-minded anger and like-minded grievance, to maybe push them in a certain direction, that's what we're trying to avoid. We want people to express themselves. We want people to be able to express their grievances openly. And so at the State Department, when we engage bilaterally in this issue, which, as you know, in the last year, this issue has really taken on sort of part of the global agenda, from the President's White House CVE Summit through the summer of summits into the UN General Assembly last year. We've got a lot of countries talking about this. So our role has been to make sure that as they develop these national CVE action plans and develop their own endemic CVE programming, they are rights respecting, and they do not mute sort of the First Amendment that we have rights, or the freedom of speech rights that they should have, to allow their citizens to address these issues and to talk about these grievances. So that, I think, is a very important aspect of what we're doing. If I can address the funding issue real quick as well. I agree, and that is the danger. It's one of the things we talked about earlier, is having to take a very good preventive program and having to label it as CVE just to get some funds. So what we've been doing specific to this issue is trying to link up those private sector, those foundations, those entities that want to get involved in the preventive development space, but don't necessarily want to be in the CVE space. There's a lot of foundations that we're talking to, that people across the government are talking to, saying, you should get involved in CVE. No thanks. But how about you get involved in this program in Jordan that really builds the capacity of youth? Well, that's something we're interested in. How do we get involved? So it's broadening the aperture of the people who might be able to help as well. And that's part of what we're doing in our building out of our CVE process.
So I'm going to ask a kind of provocative question of the room and to try and sort of link up these two threads. I'm not sure I can answer a question about funding, but I will say, you know, the thread about securitization of interventions and, you know, dealing with other potential means of confronting grievance through nonviolent means. I think that there's some connectivity there. So I want to ask a question of the crowd. How many of you have been arrested? Good, that's good. Here in the United States, yeah, right? And how many have spent more than 30 days in jail? I spent a lot of time in American prisons and also in prisons in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. I've also spent a lot of time examining prisons in the Caucasus. And I can't really say enough about the link between not marginalization, but social stratification and the targeting of particular groups that then builds grievance. And it builds grievance into sometimes nonviolent political action and sometimes violent political action. The question is, what are we doing, and when I say we, I mean the community of practice, and then perhaps what is the US government and others who are interested in really making an impact in this area, what are we doing to really invest in building civil society capacity to react nonviolently? What are we doing to discourage governments, you know, from Cairo to Kabul, from imprisoning journalists and human rights workers? How vocal are we really, ultimately? Because, you know, our silence is actually complicity. And it really does ultimately close off the avenues to protest nonviolently, to act nonviolently. But we should also not fool ourselves. You know, I grew up on the south side of Chicago during the time when busing actually was still kind of an issue. Schools were just being desegregated. They're still not really fully desegregated. But I remember vividly that experience. And I remember vividly what it took to get to school on a daily basis. And I think there are communities here in the United States that remember vividly the sacrifices that are made along the way. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking that, you know, advocating for nonviolent action will result in overnight change. It will result in a lot of killing, a lot of assassinations, a lot of legal lynchings. And that is something that we have to be prepared to support our sort of other brothers and sisters across the way and acknowledge that reality, particularly in the work that we're doing vis-a-vis research, because we expose a lot of people to a great deal of danger when we ask them to go out and answer our questions. So I'll just sort of leave you with that thought.
Maybe one more comment on these, and then we'll get to
Okay. I would say, again, on the issue of people being able to raise grievances in a productive way as well. And I think that a major issue we've seen is that there are tons of these youth voice programs, which are important, but those programs are about changing power structures. And one of the concerns we've had in many of those programs is that we're not working with the other side of the equation, the local community structures or regional and national governments to be able to hear those voices. And so that just breeds frustration amongst those young people engaged in these programs. And so we've been really conscious of being able to work on both sides of the equation. Often on youth employment programs, we talk about those market-based responses and making sure everything is market-driven. we actually at Mercy Corps really try to think about that in terms of civic engagement and youth governance programs as well, that you need to work on both sides of the equation so you're not fueling these frustrations. I'll actually be a little provocative as well. When you asked your question, I did think about Syria and where we are now. And a lot of what people are saying now, was it worth it? So you had people protesting, and now we've had 5 years of the most horrific violence. It's the most depressing conflict I have ever worked on. And likely we will see Assad at the end, still in power. And so, yes, if we can get that non-violent, constructive conflict, that's wonderful, and that risk is so high. And I don't know what to say to a young person willing to protest against an army that could turn violent. So, yeah.
I know I'm not supposed to, but I just want to say one sentence building on that directly, and it's based on the grievances issue. You know, I think it's time for us to be honest about that. Our side of the street is not at all clean, and a lot of grievances are not only local but also international. And when I think about Syria, I think about the invasion of Iraq, personally. And so I think, you know, it's really hard to speak to youth who are pissed off, and rightfully so, having lived and worked in the Middle East for years with these youth. And so I think we really need to, there's time for some truth-telling to the powers that be here down the street.
I'm going to get some more comments, but I also wanted to throw a kind of a question out to the crowd on this issue of local and going local. And, you know, how a lot of people in this room work locally. And how do you work truly locally, sort of within, you know, donor agendas that are frankly international, and how in your work do you manage that tension? Because that tension's not going away. And so how do we make this go local, sort of meaningful, kind of within that structure? If somebody could speak to that, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll get some more comments. Peter?
Thank you. My name is Peter Dixon from Concordis International, a local and international peace-building organization. And I'll speak to Go Local. I have two brief comments. I think that local is the current buzzword, and it's important and useful, and I don't want to speak against it. I certainly don't. But local is also global. And it's almost what you were saying, but you were saying, talking about big politics, that I come from a country where a lot of these fighters come from local communities in my country. And they are recruited via the internet, and, you know, Go Local in the developing countries that development organizations are working in is not really much of an answer. So I just think that's kind of a warning about that local is also global. But leading from that to a second comment, if the key is in the local community and maintaining or developing its resilience and so forth and so on, well, I just wonder how something hasn't been mentioned, and it's not really very relevant to today's crisis. It's not much relevant to Syria. But I wonder how much the displacement and the radicalization that is associated with IDP camps and refugee camps, which disrupt those local communities, is a factor. And okay, if we're trying to break conventional wisdom on CV, let's do it. There's lots of incentive in some countries for people actually to stay in refugee or IDP camps because of the facilities, the benefits they get in those camps, and not much incentive. And for very good relief and development reasons, people are kept in those camps, or are provided with facilities and education and water and so forth in those camps. Again, it's not particularly relevant to the Syria problem, I don't think. Maybe it is. But I just wonder how these incentives are maybe helping to reinforce that radicalization which results from displacement and breakup of those communities. Thank you.
Couple comments over here. We'll do these two, and then we'll bring it back to the...
Hi, Nick Oakley, Partners Global, but we work very locally. The question I have relates to the security sector. There's been some mention, not explicitly, about the army and the police. Just wonder, you know, they're being used really as the hard arm of enforcement and the sort of part of the security narrative, if you like. But I think that to work effectively, I mean, they also have to be part of the solution in terms of, you know, working very locally. You know, the engagements that community police or with the army are going to be key in terms of whether they create grievances or actually help with the situation. We had an interesting dilemma recently when we were putting together a proposal to work in Tunisia and working with the of how we might involve the police. You know, wondering whether that was going to be a risk factor for us, you know, or actually, you know, going to help with the process. And so, you know, I think the security sector is an interesting sort of stakeholder in this, and I'd like to, you know, hear your comments about whether you have examples of where they're getting this right. You know, where are there good examples on the ground of either the army, you know, really engaging with the community well, constructively building trust, and similarly with community, if there's kind of, you know, with the police rather, if there's community policing type experiences that you can share with everyone.
I'm David Steele, Brandeis University, also about 25 years practice in the field. I want to question the title of this session. Two parts to it. First of all, breaking conventional wisdom. Secondly, based on evidence. My two questions really are you really breaking conventional wisdom? Most of what I've heard you say, I've heard say in most sessions like this recently. In fact, if you want to go back far enough in terms of local involvement, I was directing projects in the 1990s and was encouraged by U.S. government agencies then in terms of funding to do exactly that. It's grown a lot since then, but that's not a new idea. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's not really breaking convention for this kind of group here. Might be breaking convention for some others. Or the whole comments that I hear often about ideology not really having a role now. Can't really talk about countering that. That's not really what it's about. It seems to me that don't we really have to look at a broad spectrum of things in order to really counter the various kinds of conventional wisdom that we might not just find in this room, but anywhere? That's my question number one. Second question, based on evidence. You can come up with evidence that shows concretely in this situation on these particular issues X, Y, or Z. Fine. What I sometimes hear from you, as well as many people when we talk, is drawing these big conclusions then about the way it is. And that's the point at which I want to step back and say, how are we really using evidence? What conclusions are we drawing from what we see? And how do we need to really think about the ways in which we do M&E effectively and with a broad enough vision as to what we're looking at and the kinds of conclusions that we draw? Those are my two questions.
Jen, I wonder if I could ask you about Peter's question, and particularly because you talked about the neighborhood as the unit of analysis, and I think it's a very good point. If violent extremism emerges in conflict-affected areas, what happens if those neighborhoods, those communities are broken, they've been displaced, they've been disrupted? How does that affect, you know, our intervention strategies in this place if we're trying to start with the community or the neighborhood?
That's a great question, and I think it speaks to the other point, which is it's really specific to the neighborhood. So if I could ask Peter, were you referring to a neighborhood in the UK, or were you referring to a neighborhood in the world?
UK, Brussels suburbs, you know, countries, and less so for the USA, I understand. But in Europe, there are many countries that are providing a solid, steady supply of violent extremists for various conflicts.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important. It's important to note that the reasons why youth might join in the UK are incredibly different from the reasons why youth might join in Libya, for example, or in Indonesia. And so this neighborhood-based approach, I think, from the start, we have to know what the neighborhood is and what it looks like and what are the challenges facing youth in that place. It's an unfortunate reality, I would say, that in current experience, given the way that funding works and regulations are, we tend to be working in, even though our mandate for our project is across the Middle East and North Africa, we're working in the lowest risk places because they're the safest places. We're not working in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, we're working in Morocco and Tunisia. That's for my project personally. So I'm not able to speak to the strengthening that needs to come to a community that has already passed that tipping point personally. But I do take the point very seriously. And I think it has to do with the point that the last gentleman made, whose name I missed, about the tendency I think we have to draw big conclusions and how dangerous that can be. So to give a brief example of that, to speak to the diversity of this problem and of the solutions to this problem, our team last year had a workshop where we brought together members of civil society from 6 countries across the Maghreb and Sahel. So it was Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Libya. And we had them break into country teams at one point and talk about what were the biggest drivers of, actually we talked about youth problems, we didn't talk about extremism unless it came from them, and what were the biggest sources of resilience in their communities. And what was really striking to me was that in Libya, clans and tribes were seen as a big source of violence, and they were a big problem. And simultaneously at the Niger table, they had said clans and tribes were our biggest source of resilience. And so these are 2 neighboring countries with, we talk about the Maghreb Sahel like it's all one thing. And this is like in direct opposition to one another. And if you take that down to the community level, it gets much more nuanced from there. So I would strongly recommend, or strongly second the, pushing back against the big conclusions.
Irfan, I wonder if I could ask you about the police military question. I know State Department has obviously done an enormous amount of work with security sector actors. So, kind of, what does the evidence tell us about engaging security sector?
Well, I think that's dead on. I mean, we shouldn't be looking at the security sector law enforcement relationship as just a big problem and it has to be solved. They can be part of the solution. We've, I think, worked with a lot of different entities across the world to build up their capacity, number one, to understand how a flawed security sector or law enforcement relationship with communities can actually drive violent extremism in certain localities, but also how that same relationship can work to develop those off-ramps, to develop those alternatives at a very early stage. And I'll give you 2 very quick examples. One, just a few days ago in the Washington Post, there was an article about an outreach program from the Las Vegas Police Department. So when you talk about CVE in Las Vegas, they don't necessarily go together, but what they're doing out there is striking. They're actually getting very involved in the engagement aspect at a very early stage. They're taking the ethos of community policing and running with it. And I think that is a model that other jurisdictions in the United States can look to. From a European perspective, there was a program out of Belgium called COPRA, Community-Oriented Policing to Prevent Radicalization. COPRA was, I think, well ahead of its time when it was developed a few years ago, because they were trying to get a lot of these police officers who are very Belgian, very French, and again, to your point, to actually get into Molenbeek, Schaerbeek, Vilvoorde, to get into Birmingham and Manchester. And when they're patrolling, when they're out there interacting, they're not interacting from a place of fear. They're interacting from a place of, we're here to protect and serve.
Candace, I wonder if I could ask you to speak to this evidence question. It's similar to the question I asked you before. How do we think locally, but then also, at some point we need some more generalizable lessons. We can't look at every community around the world to develop our programming. So, early days with Resolve, but how are you thinking about this issue?
That's a good question. I think it's a little bit incumbent on the community of researchers that is trying to tackle this problem, whether it's here or locally, to look, sort of flip the script and invert the problem set in a way, in the sense that is there evidence of greater accountability for local police forces, right? Because that's, there's always this sort of, what are the youth doing? Are they out there bomb throwing? Well, they're probably not, actually. And so you're always in this situation of trying to prove a negative, right, and deal with the counterfactual. But there are other metrics out there, particularly around prosecution, arrests, appeals, recidivism rates that we're not spending a lot of time on. We ran into some researchers actually at California. I see some of the University of San Diego folks here. Excellent conference that was put together at the Kroc Institute. And we ran into some researchers who were really looking at the very granular aspects of the lived experience of somebody in Peshawar or in Karachi. And that lived experience is high exposures of levels of threat from homicide. Period, end of story. Criminal homicide, robbery. These are statistics that we're not, for whatever reasons, we haven't encouraged local governments to really get out there and collect these kinds of statistics, which is a completely different evidence base. But that lived reality of the neighborhood, something that we examine all the time here when we think about criminal justice, and when we think about, for instance, police shootings in the United States, or when we think about black-on-black crime. I mean, these are things that are very obvious to us here, but for whatever reasons, we don't ask this of the governments that we spend so much time partnering with and funding. But the reality is, there is something to be said for conditions-based aid, I think. I think there is something to be said for making sure that our programming, particularly from a USG perspective, really encourages governments to be accountable to their people. And that's the new evidence base that we need to encourage, generally speaking.